Welcome to tonight's panel, part of Place and Displacement, Illuminations at Cal Performances, one of a series of discussions that are happening that bridge artists and researchers, organizers, and sector professionals to deepen our understanding of arts and also other sectors of work in the world. Tonight's panel is co-hosted by the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. And we have an amazing panel tonight. We're going to be talking about Place, which is directed by Patricia McGregor and written by Ted Hearne and Saul Williams. My name is Evan Bissell. I'm the Arts and Cultural Strategy Coordinator at the Othering and Belonging Institute, and really excited to be here tonight with an amazing group of guests. So thank you all for joining us and taking the time to experiment with this conversation with us. So I'm going to just start from afar and come down the line, and then we'll start with some questions for each of you. So Saul Ruiz is one of the performers in Place. Isaiah Robinson, another performer. Ted Hearne, writer, musician, composer. Regina Williams, the executive director at Silicon Valley at Home. And Nicole Montojo, housing research analyst at the Othering and Belonging Institute. So I want to start, because we are in a place tonight, I want to start with Nicole. And Nicole is the author, the lead author of a really powerful report called Roots, Race, and Place, which looks at the kind of history of exclusionary housing policies in the Bay Area. And so, you know, Nicole, in our work, in our research, I know redlining is a word that gets used a lot now. It's been used in popular culture a lot, and there's sometimes not as much that much specificity to what it actually means. And I'm curious if you could just share a few key examples of historical examples from here in the Bay Area that have led to the possibilities of gentrification today, here in the Bay Area, but also thinking more broadly.
Thanks for the question. I think it's important to acknowledge that gentrification that's happening today is part of a historic process that has evolved over time, and this is just the latest chapter in a story of people of color being displaced in multiple ways over generations. And there have been a series of policies and practices that happen at the state and federal, but also at the local level that contributed to that. And it also wasn't just government policies, but also practices from the real estate industry and from individuals. And this story of displacement goes back to the very founding of this country with indigenous dispossession and the idea of privatizing land as property and really limiting who it is that is able to own property, specifically at that time white men. And so we've seen the evolution of that over time to create vulnerable, different vulnerabilities to displacement that we see today. And one critical point in the Bay Area's history was after World War II, when white flight started to happen and white folks were moving out of cities like Oakland and San Francisco to suburbs. And part of the policy decisions around that were suburbs being incorporated into their own cities, which allowed them to enact restrictive zoning policies that led to the inability for folks to, for the development of more affordable housing options. And specifically at that time, zoning was leveraged as a way to protect property values with the idea that property values were conflated with race, in that certain people would drive down property values, and the decision to limit the types of housing that could be built were driven by these motives and the desire to protect white wealth. And at the same time, disinvestment was happening in the inner city, and capital and jobs were moving out to the suburbs. And then we see now, as capital is moving back, there are folks who haven't been able to build wealth, who haven't been able to access the same opportunities of ownership because of these practices that have limited where people of color could move to and access loans and mortgages to buy homes. And a lot of that was also at that time driven by the real estate industry, like I said, specifically directing what neighborhoods people would be able to access, what homes they'd showed folks, and in a practice called racial steering, which was directly embedded in the realtor's code of ethics as a practice. Like, you weren't, as a realtor, supposed to introduce a person of color to a neighborhood that's white, with the understanding that that would impact property values. So now, as
Can I just pause you for a second? Because I think one of the things that's so amazing about that is that it's a story about how somebody impacts value, right? So it's already embedded in it. Like, these laws reflect a story, and then the laws retell the story again, right? And so there's this way that story is already moving through this research that you're doing. And I want to, if we can, just pivot over to Ted to think about, like, what types of research were you doing as you were starting to develop this piece and think about it? Like, what were some of the stories that you recognized or that were lodging in your body that were making you think, okay, I actually want to dig into this deeper to get into some of these things that Nicole was speaking about?
Well, I mean, it's fascinating to hear you talk about this, and the history of redlining and the history of displacement and housing policy in the country. I mean, you said it so incredibly. It's all, of course, rooted in the dispossession of indigenous people, right? And we have such a long history there. That research. I mean, for me as an artist, like, this was something that I was learning more and more about, and I learn more about it every time I read about it, right? But I was living in a neighborhood in Brooklyn that I saw change. I mean, I was a resident of New York I moved in 2000, and I moved to Brooklyn in 2009, I think. And this was the the last term of the Bloomberg administration. Just seeing the neighborhood of Fort Greene change from when I would visit the neighborhood early in the early aughts to the makeup and the types of businesses that were in the city, in the neighborhood, and the disparity of wealth that got greater. And I think, but when I moved from Fort Greene in 2014, I was living in the zip code that had the greatest disparity of wealth in the city. So I was aware of that stuff, but as an artist, like, what. I don't know. I wanted to, like, how can I contribute to that conversation, right? I mean, other than, as a human being, right? I mean, it was like reading about displacement and reading about gentrification and thinking about, my complicity in that, and thinking about our relationship as citizens to those concepts is important. But as an artist, like, how can the work provoke conversation in a different way? Right. So, I mean, your question is about stories. I think I interpret that as like the history that Nicole spoke about. Like, how can the piece in many ways started to become about like examining generational patterns, and of course, there is white wealth in the country. We have a history of it, of just protecting that wealth, and of course, we see like so much inherited wealth concentrated in white families, to the detriment of everybody else in this country, right? I mean, that's like the history of the policy, and that's what affects the housing market. So, like, how can a piece of art or a piece of music like engage with, our, I don't know, like, what's the conversation between our present relationship to sounds and music and musical patterns, and the relationship that we have, that I have as a composer and a performer with you performers, and like our different backgrounds. What's that relationship in the present versus like the generational, the ancestors? Like, what are we carrying on from the people that were in our families in the past, and like how can we access that? I think about that as stories and about maps that are sort of overlaid on each other. Think about a neighborhood. How do we map a neighborhood? Like, we live in it in the present, but of course the neighborhood is the history of the neighborhood, and everyone who lived there, and everyone has their own different maps in the present and in the past. So for me, I'm rambling a little bit, but the piece is sort of about engaging the story in that way, I think.
Thank you. And I think just one thing to clarify, oftentimes when I get into these spaces, and nobody's asking artists to solve all of it, right? So it's like thinking about what is that contribution that artists bring, what's the unique element and skill set, right, that artists have when they come in, and the types of technologies of research or noticing or witness or composition that you bring to this type of thing, right? And so within that context, Regina, I want to turn to you because you have built a lot of housing, and truly affordable housing, like deeply affordable housing, supportive housing, and now you're working in policy in that world. And so I'm really curious for you, even with this caveat of artists can't solve this issue, obviously, but what are the types of what are the narratives that make your work harder, and what are the narratives that make your work easier, and what types of stories, or why do stories like music, journalism, fiction, poetry, why do they matter to your work as a housing builder, but now as a policy advocate?
Yeah, I really appreciate what Ted was saying because, what I realize about this work in terms of, creating communities that are sustainable for everyone to thrive, it's about connectedness. It's about being able to see yourself in your neighbor. It's about how we define community. And so that's why these narratives are so, critical, because there are folks who have power, who have wealth, who are able to determine who can live somewhere and who aren't. And it's about how they see, the significance of other people who may not have as much power, who may not have as much, wealth, who are disenfranchised, how they see that connectedness, that need for them to be in community with them. And that's a lot of the narrative that we tell around affordable housing when we're going out and we're advocating in communities, wealthy neighborhoods or urban neighborhoods, wherever it is. Folks are concerned about, well, who are you bringing into my neighborhood? Who are you bringing into my community? And we have to tell that story about this is someone who is already in your community, someone who's already your neighbor. It is up to us in this public policy advocacy space to make sure that people understand how we need one another. And so I think it's very valuable to approach, the work from this artistic perspective. It's really, really important. And what's harmful to the work that we do is really the othering, right? The ability to say, well, I can afford to live here. And if you cannot, then that means you need to live somewhere else, whether that's, remaining in this community unhoused, or whether it's displaced, 2 hours away from your roots. I think, Nicole, you mentioned roots. History is so important, and we have to remember that, we thrive where our roots are, where our networks are, where our people are, and we sort of have to continue to expand the perception of what that network is and who that community is. So that's sort of what we're working against. And, any narrative that sort of contributes to us feeling connected or feeling like, we have collective power, not, I need to make sure I have more power than you, is really important. Another thing that we talk about is staying power in our work. And to think about that, how do we support people so that they can just stay where they've grown up, where they go to, school, where they work, where they, go to church, whatever that is, that connection that they have. How do we increase the power, strengthen their roots so that they're not displaced?
Thank you for that. Yeah. So when you first enter the piece, you enter, or as I interpret it, it's kind of a response to Ted's first section, right? And it's in some ways it actually has to me, it had a feeling of anger to it, right? It's like a response. I think that's the part that it builds into what about my son, right? And so there's this part where you're kind of like waiting and you're looking at the camera, and this is in the quarantine version. And I'm wondering about the space for anger in this work also, right? Because part of a deep connection is being able to express those types of things. And so I'm wondering how that's come up for you as a performer, but also in, I know you haven't been able to tour the work yet, really, but, as you think about this work, but yeah, where does that come up for you as a performer and thinking about that and especially in entering the piece in that way?
Yeah, so the way that I see my role when I come in is that I'm asking a question. I'm asking a question if it's okay to be angry. And in a lot of ways, I feel like it's okay to be angry, but for some people, they don't even understand what you're angry about. So in a lot of ways, I've experienced firsthand being displaced. So, and I think with the pandemic and everything that's happened, we can look at this piece in a completely different perspective than we had before. This piece was made before the pandemic, but then after the pandemic gave the meaning of this piece such more weight. And everything that it says kind of like was predicted. And it is something really strange because now we're saying this from a whole different experience that we spent a few years absorbing the pandemic and absorbing the displacement and everything. And now, are we angry? I think that we are. We're angry, but I think in a lot of ways, we're just, everything has happened that everybody has seen things in different perspectives. And I think that we're understanding that there's so many ways to see this situation.
Thank you. And I want to come back to another point that you were starting to bring up, Regina, about history and some aspects of erasure. And Isaiah, to pose a question for you that, I think a lot of times of gentrification as an imposition of context or completely erasing context and just bringing in an importing of context, right? So it's, the Midwestern New York, or the whatever, the suburban LA in the middle, in East LA or whatever it is, right? So what, and one of the things that gets changed when that happens is the sound, right? Like the sound shifts, right? When I think about my experience with Fort Greene Park is Soul Summit, right? So that's a sound that's very specific to that area. And so how do sounds shift, in place? And I'm, as a singer, and I read, in your bio that you claim, your training is in the church also, right? And so what do you bring into the piece in terms of what is the staying power you are bringing through your performance, and how does it relate to place?
That's such an interesting question. The staying power that I bring to the piece, simply put, I can't think about my upbringing in church, and I can't think of words like staying power without thinking of other words like faith and hope, and also, inquisitiveness, curiosity. And these are, even as today, I've been thinking about my approach to the piece now, my intent with the piece as an individual now versus 2 years ago, versus 4 years ago. All of us having been affected in different ways by the pandemic, and all of us having been not all of us, but, Sol and I've had, somewhat similar experiences. Just as we were starting this piece, I was in the process of, being displaced, I was living in Hyde Park. Half a block away from the Obama house is where I was, So already, not even up and coming, but Hyde Park is what I'd like to call a diamond in the rough in Chicago. And my building owners sold the building abruptly. And I found myself, having to find a place to go, but it also gives me, a connection to generational, not wealth, but generational property. I went from there into my ancestral home, the home that my grandparents bought in 1968 at the height of white flight. My grandparents were the second Black family to move onto the block, which is now predominant. The whole area is predominantly Black, and I find myself now, a homeowner paying a mortgage on property that's been in my family for more than 50 years already. I'm still paying more, I don't want to get into the specifics of why that is. But like, yeah, that's the thing. I'm doing, so there are lines you've written that like really, yeah, like, that subprime mortgages line is some shit for me, for real. Excuse me.
Saul Williams wrote that line, yeah, like it's amazing how the words do resonate with individuals. And like, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No.
I just want to incorporate this with what you said about context, right? It's like it's really interesting way of framing it. I don't forget what you said exactly, but like it's gentrification often finds you like a place without context, or takes strips a place of its context or something.
Well, and it's also
imports, right? Yeah, it
imports
imports some corporate context or something. But like I think about the context of music all the time, and like there's types of work where it's about some sort of like pristine ideal, right? And then there's types of work where it's about like the conversations happening among the different contexts in it, right? And I write music for my friends, right? And like this is like such a big part of the piece is like knowing who the individuals are who sing it, and of course you like bring yourself to it. It like if I don't know, if you were doing some like production of whatever Lakme, and you were and like there was some director who didn't know you and just could like stick any tenor in there, and then it's you, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if you experienced the pandemic 2 years ago or not, right? Sure. But of course, like in this piece, and that's like such a beautiful thing about music is that you can continue to bring your experience to it, and it will affect the piece, and like the conversation around everyone's different experiences and like what that means. I mean, I think that is related to what you were saying about like not about seeing someone who's different than you as seeing yourself reflected. It's like having that conversation and being part of the same community. And because music is this abstract space in a way, it can sometimes serve as a metaphor for the thing that we want to see.
Certainly. I think it's also important to point out, though, everyone loves music. Everyone loves it. I mean, I've never met a person who doesn't like or enjoy music. But then it becomes a question of what kind of music do you like? Music speaks to your body and your mind, even without a lyric being uttered, And so
it is the universal language.
it is, that and mathematics. But I mean, well, music is audible. Music is audible math, is what I call it. It is. It's math that you can hear, really. But I don't want to. I'm really good at not staying.
No,
focused.
no. But
what I bring to the piece, though, I think is, with that hope and with that faith. Hope and faith in what? That there's common ground. That there is common ground, but the understanding of that common ground and what it is, because the piece does have a lot to say, and and not all of it's comfortable, and not all of it's comforting. A lot of it isn't. And there is anger, and well. How you present, or when you're dealing cards like these, when you're telling somebody something that's hard to hear, the way you present it is of the utmost importance, because, you can tell the truth, but if you lay it out there in a way that's unpalatable or hard to receive, well then, if you weaponize the truth, then what's the purpose in having it? You want people to accept the truth? You want people to learn, or do you want to just be right? So, I think it's more important than just being right. It's about that understanding, not just comprehending someone, but to stand under them. To flip the word.
Yeah. No, it's a really. I appreciate this, right? Because it's not enough to just be right? Because then I think we see this all the time in research, and we see this in advocacy as well. Is that there are a right thing, but maybe that's not going to go over and get through in that way, right? And so I think to kind of come back to that end of it, what are, some of the potentials that you're seeing in terms of like, this is Regina or Nicole, either of these questions, but what are some of the real potentials that you see as that truth moving forward for how do we build a thriving housing environment for everybody? And what are some of those challenges that we're facing in terms of like the truth being weaponized against kind of these efforts as well? For either of you.
Okay, sure. I'm most excited about the movements that are really gaining momentum, that are really challenging our reliance on the markets to provide the housing that our communities need and want. I think there's a lot of amazing work happening at the neighborhood level through community land trusts and co-ops and other alternative forms of ownership that are really centering permanent affordability and staying power and anti-displacement. And I think those are all really important, and changing the story around property owners' entitlement to unbridled wealth, and really instead centering our collective responsibility to make sure that everyone in our society has access to safe and dignified housing. Just to add to that, I'd say an important place to start is with tenant protections, like as a baseline, and rent control being an important part of that many communities in the Bay Area don't have. And just again, going back to this notion that housing is shouldn't be a commodity, something to extract wealth from, but really an essential basic need that we need to make sure that everyone can access.
And I'm just so appreciative of Nicole and her work and others like her, because the truth, I don't know, we're talking about the truth being palatable and everything, but everything's so veiled in this country and in this society that right now in this moment, I feel like the truth is necessary. It's very important that we're grounded in that context of how this country began, on the backs of others, on other, stripping other people of their land. I think that's so incredibly important when we talk about, gentrification and placemaking and what it means for, Black and Indigenous and people of color to really struggle with, being able to be and live. So, I think that, yes, it's important to have the conversation in a way that folks can receive it. But right now, I feel like it's important to have the conversation in a way that's honest and that tells the truth about the history, about where we are, about the inequality that exists, and about the fact that, there's a lot that's owed to people that we haven't yet faced yet in this country, and about the fact that this displacement is still happening, is still occurring. And so I don't feel like we've told enough truth yet to really have the conversation in a way that can be fruitful. And that's why, your work is so critical.
People are still getting displaced, and there's still some people that are being discriminated to get loans. Then there's no solution yet. They still haven't figured it out. So, and I think that the main people that are in charge of all the banks and all those things, they don't understand really what the problem is. And it's very actually frustrating.
I might disagree with you there, because, everybody, each one of us wants to feel like we have some sort of power, some sort of control of something, our own lives, our own destiny, our circumstances, when really we don't. But, even them, the ones who own all the banks and control all the everything, they have a control over a lot. The point that I'm making is that that sense of control is something that none of us will easily relinquish over whatever it is we think we have control over, and power power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so like, yeah, the solution is pretty easy, but like, but greed is a thing. It is a thing that we're fighting as human beings, and that's, that is more for me, less for you. That's a, solution, as well. If there wasn't greed, that would solve a lot. But, well, okay. So,
just to ground it, Ted, and just one thing, the way that the piece opens is really also through your perspective as a white man, right? And thinking about that as one of these places that is one of these truths that maybe not enough has been said about. And there's a quote early on that I think you're quoting Baldwin, talking about, the origins of, in Baldwin's language, the origins of the Negro problem are that white men not wanting to be judged and seen as we really are, right? And so this affective or this sense of fear, white fear, right, that is kind of behind some of these truths. And I'm curious, like, what have you all learned or thought, like how your dialogues about whiteness and its relationship to place and cities, like how have those evolved for you in the process of making this piece together?
Well, I mean, it's been a journey, and it's an ongoing journey. It's that consideration that Baldwin quote's amazing, and I started to see the relationship of whiteness in every part of growing up, and maleness, like being raised as a white man in this country, in my generation anyway, in my family, meant to not like ever think of my identity. It's like you just don't have to, because it's just the neutral one or something, right? I mean, and like to come to that later and to like examine that was like the root of it. To like, how can I think about the maps of my neighborhood if I'm not examining that, right? But then of course that becomes quickly a circling narcissism and the consideration of one's own guilt and one's own complicity, which is why we sort of thought about the form of the piece being that I would like sort of start in that pattern and then hand that text to Saul Williams, and then he would write real poems, and he would take the rest of the text of the piece and structure it, right? But then also another question, I mean, your question like begs this question that I have been having now that we have put the work out, and we performed it at BAM, and now we're performing it at Cal Performances, and we're like making this thing, right? And people are buying tickets and gonna see it. And the question with so much artwork, especially if you're trying to get at something real, trying to like engage with truth, is like, how does this not get co-opted, right? And living in racial capitalism, like in this stage, we need to ask that all the time, right? And I was just wondering from Regina and Nicole, like if you had ideas about that in a larger political context, because like I don't know, I mean, here we are in this like very quote unquote liberal city, right? And like, we're not in Texas, where you can blame stuff on the Republicans, right? And like, of course, like the displacement here is, and I live in Los Angeles, I mean, it's like egregious, right? I mean, and these are Democrats, right? And we're making a piece where people buy tickets and they come to it, and like, it's our responsibility to make sure that we don't provide them some capsule you can feel bad about this issue and you can think about it and then you can get a catharsis and leave, right? And like, think about it that way. And there's a metaphor there too with like general society politically, right? And I was just wondering, since you're both so knowledgeable about like the actuality of it, like if you have ideas about like helping, to like ward off like the co-opting of the conversation so that nothing actually happens, I
mean, we've seen that challenge for sure. There's a desire to, once you see that something is problematic, to do something and fix it. And, what we have around housing and inequality, it's just so nuanced. It's so, so nuanced that just that little simple, aha, I can fix it. I can build housing here, pick people up, they move here, they have access, we're done. It's not that simple. And the way I like to explain it to folks is about the process. You can't just come up with a solution. it's also about the process of how you've gotten to that solution, right? And I can see that you've thought about that even in creating your work, right? It's about how we get there. It's not just about the destination, because actually, if you don't have enough inclusion, contribution, diversity in the actual process to get there, you may not have the appropriate recognition of what the goal is and all of the limitations. So we can't be isolated in how we think about like what we're doing, what we're producing. We have to constantly be sort of touching base, right? And that's what, and it brings, it brings me back to what Nicole talked about in terms of community-led solutions. Like, how do we involve people who we're trying to affect their lives in the process of coming up with the solutions? And it has to be ongoing and continuous. And, I don't know how that relates to the arts, but I just know how I think about it in my work.
But I think that's a really interesting question, because I was listening to this other researcher, Brandy Thompson Summers, before this panel today, and she was talking about how at a center, or part of the gentrification story is that diversity is part of what attracts people back to cities, and that's leveraged for marketing and redevelopment. And then there's this extraction that happens from that of Blackness and Black culture, but there's still the specific exclusion of Black people. And what does it mean to contend with that, I think, is part of what you're asking. And I don't know the answer, but I feel like asking that question up front and being up front with that as you go about putting this work out into the world is one place to start. But I wonder if anyone else has thoughts on that question too.
No, please. That's your show.
No, it's not my show. It's our show.
Oh, it's
I thought this was going to be like more of a talk show.
Yeah, we can make it like that.
You're on the
end.
No.
Is it your show?
No, it's not.
Go ahead. That's it.
In relation to, the use of diversity to attract people back to cities, and the black face of it all, for lack of a better term, the billboards that, that may include us, and, and the way, the ways in which we may be represented in the advertisement for a particular place or neighborhood, but not necessarily, but then, okay, someone like me calls to apply to get an apartment in one of these spots, and it's like, okay, yeah, well, come on down and see us, and, pay our $450 application fee, and then we'll take your application and we'll look at it, and then we'll be in touch. Oh, wait, you mean I don't get an interview right away after? This is just the application fee? This is not first month's rent? This is, no, y'all want $400 just for me to apply, and then y'all might accept my application? Am I gonna get my $400 back? Oh, but if $400 doesn't really matter to me that much, then okay, it's all right with them. Okay, yeah, $400 is fine. That's the first test right there. Where there's poverty, there's crime, and it's like, well, the idea of, I don't want to live next to you because of what you don't have, and, or I don't know, or just how you are, or what have you, It's so much of it is about the individualism that our society has created. Even within families, it's this me, mine, what's yours is yours, and what's mine is mine, and that mentality, I think is part of the problem. What's the solution? I have to at least offer a solution, because I don't like being a person to point out a problem not offer possible solutions. Everybody just be less greedy. No, everyone just understanding, I think, is one of the solutions. We all come from different cultures. I think there's a distinct difference between race and culture. And we all have, and well, what is the difference, I think culture has to do with how we express our feelings. There isn't any one way that I can feel that you are incapable of feeling. We all can feel the same things. We all may express those feelings differently based on our culture, and that's why I think they're called cultural expressions. Okay, so I make it a point to dive in and explore other cultures and encourage people to dive in and explore their own cultures. That's really important to me as someone who who's from a group of people who have our cultural expressions taken from us a lot. And also as a person who cannot trace my lineage back to the country of origin that my ancestors came from, for a person like me who doesn't have a native language tied to a country in Africa or cuisine that I know to cook that came from a country in Africa, my cultural expressions stem from my history, here, and the history of my ancestors, and so I really take joy in seeing other people hang on to, the cultural identities, those that are able to hang on to the cultural identities from their ancestors, because we're all immigrants here in this country, and so I take joy in Irish people being all Irish about it, and German people being all German about it, and so on and so forth, and learning about that and encouraging people to do that, because there, in understanding the cultural expressions, it's like, okay, this is how these people express that very same feeling that I feel. And I feel like if there was more of that around, first of all, we'd realize that, we all feel so many of the same things, and we all feel so many of the same ways. And, that's another common ground that we have, that I think we maybe don't engage in enough, and if I just understand the way you express this feeling, it's like, okay, Yeah.
I just want to make a comment on something you said about, as a Black person not being tied to our country of origin. I think, we've been talking about displacement without really exploring why it's harmful to people. And I think for Black people especially, like, our roots in community in this country are so important because of that lack of roots to like a lack of a tie and connection to a country of origin. And so it's just like displacement on our community, I feel like, is just that much more harmful and impactful. And because, some people might say, well, you can't live here, go live there. What's the problem? But it's like, this is significant, like this history repeating itself in the form of, being moved from one place to the other against your will, and how, like, that's critical. I mean, some folks do have roots in their culture that they can, in a way take with them. I don't want to minimize what displacement is on other communities, but for Black people, I feel like it might be that much more harmful.
Really, even when it's something like projects being torn down, like that, it's bittersweet. The Robert Taylor projects in Chicago, until its demolition in 1998, from what I understand now, I could be wrong about this, but I do believe it was the world's largest housing project up until its demolition. It went from 25th and State Street in Chicago all the way to 55th and State. That's what, like 20 blocks? Nothing but, and each square block had at least 3 18-story high-rise buildings. I mean, just when they built them in the 60s, right along with an expressway, that was a big racial barrier, whole nine. And like by the 90s, like, man, I mean, all I was hearing was stories about how the projects used to be nice, and and how dangerous they are now, and this, and like, yeah, man. And so, and now they're gone, and it's like, and now they're building new mixed income, housing developments. They're not high rises, and it's like, okay, so, and all those families, like, and it's not to say that, they didn't want to go necessarily, like, and they moved them out to the south suburbs, which is like, say, hey, we'll take you out of the projects and we'll give you a house in the suburbs. And folks just like took that and ran with it, which is, yeah, great, a step up. Well, if I'd lived a couple generations in the projects and an organization was like, yo, look, yeah, we're leveling these, do you want a house? It's like, yeah, I want a house. Seems like a better life, right? And it just hasn't really, it's not really been the result. The suburbs that they moved to, just white flight all over again. And, folks are moving back into the city. And, and the police departments out in those suburbs that used to be nice don't know what to do because crime is a thing now, because we haven't gotten rid of the poverty. We've just moved it, and people have their own houses now.
Yeah, and another thing about what you said made me think of like the power of this sort of art form, because history does repeat itself. And we've learned in this age that people can choose to believe what history is, they can rewrite it, but art sort of kind of, I don't know, it surpasses that, or it is able to, when you kind of solidify something in an art piece, it almost becomes more real than even the history books in a way, right?
Jason Moran performed here a couple weeks ago, and Jason and Alicia Hall Moran presented their piece Two Wings, and Jason was saying in the talk back afterwards, he was saying how a lot of Black jazz composers would name their songs after places, right? Like, take the A Train, 51st Street Blues, like all these songs that were Carolina style, they had like a place name to them, right? And it's this interesting kind of like, yeah, it's a historical record that's really rooted in there. You can't take it away then, right? Because somebody else is going to pick it up and they're going to play it, and it's insurgent, and that way it's going to keep moving. So, I don't know, Ted, sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I mean, totally. That's really interesting. I don't know if this is what you meant, but I just was thinking that music, it's like abstract nature. It's not, it's abstract nature makes it harder to be twisted and lied about, it's like, how do you veil music? It just is, right? It's not, like language is so, because of its specificity, it's so like shifty actually, and you can just like, and I don't know, if I like gave you an essay about something, you'd be like, okay, I don't know, it's so boxy. You might have preconceived notions about it, or you might, I don't know, like a piece of music is just hard, it's like harder to do that with. And that's why I love text setting actually, because like, you're when you put sound to like language, then I don't know, you're like seeing it from this different perspective or whatever. It's different than like a politician speaking at you, and like it's in a lane or something. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what you made me think of.
It's fascinating because Nicole and I a couple of years ago, we were joking about this research that had been done around rent control, and literally the same statistic were interpreted two different ways in two reports based on who they were funded by in terms of like whether they are pro or con on rent control, and it's just that same thing. It's like you can just interpret the number different ways. But
someone once said somewhere, and I don't remember where, that artists have a duty to tell the truth. And I truly believe that, the truth of the time, because if you decorate space with visual art, I think you decorate time with music.
I want to make a comment too. As a Cuban American, I've been displaced from my country, even, and I don't know really my roots either. So I don't think that it's just Black Americans. I think that it happens a lot to people in the Americas, like all the Native Americans that were in the Americas, and also I don't even know at all about my ancestry, not even a couple generations back. I had to even go, because my own family denies all of our past, because when we came here to this country, they denied even a lot of the things that had to do with Cuba. So then we were placed here, and a lot of people, moved to Little Havana. Little Havana now is not what it used to be. I didn't really know when Ted first invited me to be a part of this piece. I didn't even know if I had experienced gentrification. I didn't really understand in Miami if that had happened, because it's not like New York, and we didn't experience the white flight situation. When I started living in Little Haiti, it really made a lot of sense to me. I grew up on the beach, and then I lived in Europe for some time. Then when I came back, I lived in Little Haiti. And that's where I really realized, after I had done Ted's piece, what gentrification was. Because in Little Haiti, the Haitians can't afford to live there. And now it's a white neighborhood. And it's very strange, because when I was living there, it started to happen, and it started to trickle down to all the people around us. The only place that was affordable was the place where I was living, and that the actual Haitians were living in the building. And then when the pandemic hit, they evacuated the whole building. And it was like, it was insane. I couldn't even believe what was happening, and I almost felt like squatting it, like the actual person that isn't.
The owners of the whole, they just like told everybody to get out?
Yes, and they started harassing everybody to get out, and it was a very strange situation. And that's what in the film I buy a trailer. So
that happened.
Yes, that actually happened to me in the middle of when he's like, "Oh, okay, you should do this. See if you can record."
We were filming.
See if you can record this.
Yeah, we were all like filming the piece because it was canceled because of the pandemic. So we were making a version where all the singers decided that they wanted to document themselves, and they were singing it. We were working on this project together, and then you got evicted at the exact same time. Yeah,
the guy puts the eviction notice in the same time that we're doing this film. And that I have to get the trailer and move it. And it was just a strange coincidence. This whole piece has been very eerily coincidences about all of it. And I don't know, if anybody gets a chance to see this, you gotta see it. Because so many of these things have happened, and it's like it was telling the future.
Yeah.
And I think art does that. It tells the future.
I think to Regina's point that like it tells the future and history repeats, and it's happening so much, right? That the coincidence feels like coincidence because it's been fractured, right? But it's happening on so many structural levels and so widely experienced but we experience it individually in that way. And I think part of what your work does is it allows us to come together in a place and see where we experience these things in common, right? And we see our stories reflected in different ways around that. Different emotions of anger, different emotions of fear, different emotions of connection, and different pieces like that. So I just want to do a time check because we're at an hour, and I don't want to. You all have been rehearsing all day, and I just want to. I'm enjoying the conversation, but I just want to. I want to be respectful for all your time.
I mean, I think we are all pretty tired. But
It goes back to feelings. This tired, angry, frustrated. We all have things. We all have things that we are frustrated about. We all have things we are tired of. We all have things that we are angry about. They're all different, but it's like, it's so.
Some people call it an improvement.
What's that? The
Gentrification.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's
That's the line in the last
That's
song,
from the
right?
show.
They will call it an improvement.
But it causes
price you out.
pain and
They will
hurt
call
to
it.
so many. But they call it an improvement.
You know, improvement
That's what it says.
for them. You know, there's some people that
Ramification.
there's some people that are totally fine with peace and love and equality. You know, as long as my standard of living is not threatened. And okay, that's where we have a disparity. Some people feel like their standard of living is threatened by the presence of others for one reason or another.
Well, what about the word gentrification itself, right? I mean, like, is that kind of is like that what you just said? Like, they call it an improvement. I mean, like, do you like that word? I mean, because when I started looking into it, it's like, oh yeah, gentry, the gentry is here now. Like that's actually a lie too, right? I mean, that's like it's a spin that is like, oh yeah, it's being improved. The neighborhood. I mean, that's worked into the word kind of that it is an improvement. When of course, like, yeah, improvement for who?
Improvement for who?
Beautification.
Improvement of what? You know, because in general, that stuff seems to only talk about like infrastructure, buildings, property, and not people. I mean, totally, yeah, people, but they don't. That's not said. It's not stated. You know, but changes in these environments is first mark of gentrification is building something that people that don't live there want. So that they do want to live there, like the Whole Foods in Inglewood, Chicago. Like, people in Inglewood can't afford to shop at Whole Foods. I may be able to work there, maybe, but like, okay,
that's where they get them.
Yeah, and it's just like, okay, and now, and watching the slow and the change happen there, I think one thing that we can do to, is, besides making people aware, is come up with ways, very sane and honorable way. I'm sorry, I'm starting to quote lyrics from the show as a joke because we've been rehearsing all day. But
piano,
right. Those that initiatives in gentrification to help those with established roots in a particular area maintain those roots. Through some sort of funding, some sort of initiative, some sort of something, gosh, but and I don't work in this, and it brings me back to thinking about what you said. It's not as simple as just the solution. It's about how you arrive at the solution, and so like I know it's way more complicated than anything I may have just said.
That was very inspiring how you said that, actually, about the process. Yeah. Like incorporating that journey on the process into
absolutely
into change and understanding and making the change, but really like honoring the conflict, and then I don't know, the truth along the way, that the conversations and the dialogues and the difference along the way, in order to, because that's like part of the history too. That's part of the record, and that will be repeated also.
There's a
yeah.
One of the exciting things about this moment is that some of the vessels that you named, in terms of community land trusts, multi-stakeholder cooperative housing, all these different types of forms that are being innovated and come out of a longer history as well, they forefront process, right? Process is built into that piece as well. And I think that is something that also ties into theater and performance and music, right? Is this process of constantly making and remaking a piece. And you wrote this before the pandemic. I'm sure it's, you all have been wrapping it up and changing it and redoing it again, and that's part of the evolution of that. But I want to try to bring us in and close us, unless there's more that if anybody would like to share anything else. But it's been a long day, and you all have a week of performance, of rehearsal, and then
I will say that
please,
you can survive. I've seen people in businesses survive gentrification. Mm-hmm. At least I only know one, actually, but it's an amazing story. Like this restaurant called Raging Cajun in Chicago, been there for about 25 years in Hyde Park, and the building that they were in was bought by the university, and they totally redid the building, kicked everybody out of And all, it was a yoga studio, a tarot card reader, a little hole-in-the-wall convenience store, like very old building. And they put everyone out and they totally like rehabbed the building, except for Raging Cajun. Raging Cajun, out of all the places,
keeps the neighborhood authentic.
well, you know, I guess. I mean, they have really, really good Indian food and soul food. It's bizarre.
Interesting.
Yes, no, like
Interesting mix.
traditional Indian food, and then right next to it, they've got fried chicken, collard greens, cornbred. It's good too.
Some of us haven't had dinner.
No, me. No. But the thing that I'm making about them is that they stayed open while this entire building that they inhabit was completely gentrified and rehabbed and remodeled, and every space and like the whole front of the building looks different now. But this, I think it's so amazing to me that they not only retained their place in the building, but they never closed. And like the construction went on around them. And, you know, and I looked at that and I said, I wonder how they achieved that. And I want to ask them one day. But the point that I'm making is like, yes, it's possible. There's hope.
So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I know to our audience of a few. Thank you, audience. Thank you. Yes, Soul's got it. So Soul Ruiz, Isaiah Robinson, Ted Hearne, they'll be performing, or I don't know when this is going to be. I don't know when this is happening. Hey, over here.
Saturday.
They will be performing Saturday, March 12th. This video may come up after that or before it. We don't know. But we're really grateful to have you here. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Regina Williams and Nicole Montojo, for your work. I get to work very closely with both of you and be inspired by you all the time. So thank you so much. And yeah, we'll see you next time.